And now we come to motivation. And actually, this is one of my favorite topics to talk about because it's applicable not only in language learning, but in life in general. Motivation can really affect you, and it's a big thing when you're talking about coaching, you're talking about sports, you're talking about starting a business, just having a successful life. Motivation really can move you into different directions and directions that you never thought about before. So, in language learning, we also have motivation, and it's important to remind ourselves of what our motivation is, what's pushing us, and why are we learning a language. So, let's talk about this idea of motivation. And I want you to take a moment here and to think about why you're learning a language. As the picture says, this kind of sticky notes or yellow piece of paper that we see, it asks what motivates you. So let me ask you, what's motivating you? Why are you learning the language that you're learning? Or why are you going to learn the language that you will learn? Or why are you even interested in language learning? What's your motivation? You can hit pause for a few seconds here and think about it. And if you want to write it down in your notebook just to have it to refer to later, that's cool too. So hit pause, think about what motivates you and what's motivating you to learn a language. And once you finish thinking about it, you can go on and hit play and continue on with the rest of the section. But the question now is, what's your motivation for learning a new language? So you may know, or maybe you don't know, there are two kinds of motivation. The first kind of motivation is what we call extrinsic motivation. And the second kind of motivation is what we call intrinsic motivation. When we talk about extrinsic motivation, we're talking about being motivated by something from the outside, some kind of reward, or even some kind of necessity something that we need in our lives. So some examples of this might be school. If we're learning a language for school, we need it for a grade. In some countries, like in the United States, you have to take a certain amount of language courses. When I was in university or in college, we had to take at least 3 semesters worth of a foreign language course. So that's an extrinsic motivation. We get something from the outside. If we don't take these courses or we don't learn a language, then we're not going to graduate from college. Another example of extrinsic motivation can be to get a job. If you're an immigrant somewhere, maybe you might need to learn the language of the country that you live in order to get a job. If you want a job such as a diplomat or in tourism or something dealing with foreigners or with government officials, you may need to learn another language. So in order to get a job, you have to learn a language. So that's another example of extrinsic motivation. We also have promotions. In some places and some companies, speaking another language is a skill that's sought after. And if you're able to do that, that's a skill that will put you at a higher level, higher pay grade, and at a higher position at your job. It can also be for immigration purposes. In some countries, you're required to speak a certain language, and in order to immigrate to that country, you have to speak the language. So learning that language will facilitate your ability to immigrate to the country that you want to go to. And this is another example of extrinsic motivation for language learning. And then we have what we spoke about with intrinsic motivation. When we talk about intrinsic motivation, we're talking about motivation that comes from the inside. It's something that's internal or something that's important to ourselves and to our own personal desires. Usually it's not coming from outside. It's just something that we want on the inside and that's important for us. So an example of intrinsic motivation with language learning might be interest in culture and the language. If you're learning Spanish, for example, maybe you became attracted to Mexican culture and Mexican food. So you wanted to learn more about the culture, more about what the people do, more about their music and their dancing. And you want to learn more about it and become closer to the people. So as a result, you learn the language. Another example of intrinsic motivation might be having a friend or a lover who speaks the language that you're looking for, the target language. Because these people, the friend or the lover or both, are important to you, you want to communicate with them, you want to get closer to them, so you learn the language in order to make your ties stronger with each other. Another example could be a challenge to do something different. Some people do marathons, some people do weightlifting challenges, some people want to travel around the world, some people challenge themselves to learn as many languages as they can, or to just learn a different language just for the sake of it. So it might just be a challenge to do something different, and that can be your intrinsic motivation. And then there's pride, and maybe there's ego as well involved with this, where you just want to say, I speak a different language. And so there's that kind of pride that comes out. So you learn a language just to show off, basically. Maybe it's not so common, but it does happen and it does exist. There are people who learn languages just to brag about it. But it's an example of having an intrinsic motivation to learn a language for the sake of pride. So, as we said before, there are two kinds of motivation. There's extrinsic motivation and intrinsic motivation. And extrinsic is for motivation that comes from the outside. Maybe there's a necessity, maybe there's something important. And then intrinsic is something to satisfy our own desires or to satisfy something that's important to us from the inside.